So a lot of times people make an antibody, and then once they've finally got the antibody they think they want, they think about, okay, now how can I use this antibody in the assay? And that's probably not the optimal way to think about it. Probably what's optimal is to think about the assay first and exactly what you're trying to measure, and then think about how am I going to get an antibody that's going to do that. So you've really got to think about what's my target. Is my target a native protein, like I might measure in flow cytometry or in ELISA, maybe from a serum sample? Or is my target denatured, like a protein in a Western blot or a protein in immunohistochemistry? And it's probably really important to consider that just because it's denatured, all denatured proteins are not the same. So you could have an antibody that works great in a Western blot and doesn't work at all in IHC, or maybe you have one that works in both. You need to think real carefully about what you're trying to do with that antibody. You need to think a little bit about the type of assay that you're going to do. Is it going to be a quantitative assay? And if it's quantitative, what's the degree of accuracy and precision that you want to have out of that assay? Or maybe it's a semi-quantitative assay, or maybe it's just a yes-no qualitative assay that gives you a real fast result without giving you much information about the quantity of the target that's present. And a lot of times what you're going to find is you probably want multiple formats. So you might want a real fast assay for, say, measuring protein purification, but you want a good qualitative assay later on for quantitating that protein, say, in patient sera. So those are some of the constraints that have to go into that. You also need to think a little bit about how long should this assay take to do. And you can think about that both in terms of time to an actionable result. So if I'm doing a purification, I might want a yes-no sort of an assay that I can use right away to figure out what column fraction my protein's in. Or I may have some constraints on my time. So I probably don't want to do an ELISA that's going to take me 12 steps in 12 hours to do in a day that I'm going to have to do over and over and over again. So you need to think a little bit, again, about the time constraints. And keep in mind, if you're looking at a really good qualitative assay, the way we make those really robust is we move closer to equilibrium. And we can do that with both time and the way we manipulate reagent concentrations in those assays. So it's important to think how that assay is going to be used. So then you need to think about the sample, and you need to think about the matrix that that sample is in, and how you're going to overcome any matrix effects that you might have in that assay. You also need to think about how precious that sample is, how many assays you can do with it, and you might consider that you're going to want to miniaturize that assay, or you might consider that you want to multiplex that assay, that is, try to measure multiple analytes at the same time on the same sample. That can be very effective when the sample is extremely precious. However, the antibody design for multiplex assays has some pretty severe constraints around it compared to just being able to do one at a time sorts of assays. So you need to think about all these things well in advance of when you're going to go off and have your antibody made. And you really need to make sure that whoever's making that antibody for you is thinking exactly those same sorts of thoughts. That's why it makes really good sense to partner with SDIX for your antibody development, because we don't just develop antibodies, we also do assay development.